In the Unit 9 review thing, let's kick this thing off. Let's do this thing. So Unit 9 starts in 1945, and we're just gonna go with this idea, like you see on this timeline here, that World War II and the Cold War. World War II ended in the same year that the Cold War began. We're just gonna go with 1945 as this pivot year. And there are a couple of things to know as we get into this. First of all, we're coming in at the end of World War II. Europe is devastated, and not just like losing a lot of people, but because of the total war situation, we got a lot of carpet bombing. We're not just destroyed soldiers and their lives, but also civilians and their lives, and their homes, their factories, their schools, their churches. Like, Europe needs to be rebuilt. Secondly, Europe is occupied. The western part of Europe is occupied by the United States. The eastern part of Europe is occupied by the Soviet Union. And it is this split right down the middle that causes the at least lays out the landscape of the Cold War. We've got the East controlled by the Soviets, the West controlled by the US. Germany itself is divided. So Germany managed to be unified for what, 70 years? So they basically made it as long as, they made it a couple of generations, and then now they're deunified again. And then as far as the start of the Cold War, this is it. So you'll notice there's a number up here. The numbers that show up here are the numbers that correlate with your study guide. Okay, so as far as number 1 goes, because I made these two things independently, and so they don't necessarily go in order. So for number 1, what is the reason for the start of the Cold War? We have differing goals. The US wants democratically elected governments favorable to the US. The Soviets want authoritarian governments favorable to the USSR. The US wants capitalist economic systems so they can trade with them. The Soviets want communist economic systems. And then as far as safety goes, the USSR wants buffer states. They want a shield between themselves and the West, between themselves and the US, but also particularly between themselves and the Germans. And honestly, a lot of this is down to Stalin. Stalin is an incredibly paranoid individual. He feels he can only trust dictatorships that are communist. He can't trust democratically elected governments. And he desperately does not want to be invaded again. He's lived through World War I and World War II. He is terrified of being invaded again. And so he needs those shield states, those buffer states of Eastern Europe. As far as actionable things that they did, these are the actions they took. And this corresponds with 2, 3, and 4. For example, politically, the Truman Doctrine. The USA enacts the Truman Doctrine. The Truman Doctrine says communism can exist where it does. We're not going to try to stop that, but we are going to try to stop communism from spreading. So communism is not allowed to expand according to the Truman Doctrine. The USSR, they're out to spread communism. Let's flip some more countries to communism. This doesn't really impact Europe too terribly much after the Berlin crisis. But you think about places like Korea, Vietnam, China, those are places where communism is advancing. And the Truman Doctrine turns the Cold War hot into those places, as we see the Korean War, the Vietnam War being fought. Economically, the US is out to help Western Europe. They want to rebuild. You think about the destruction of World War II, where all those houses, all those factories, all those churches need to be rebuilt. And so, from an economic perspective, those are jobs, right? You have to have workers to do all that rebuilding. And that's perfect because the US wants to create jobs in Western Europe, because if people have jobs, then they have money. And if they have money, they can buy US goods. And so the US gives the Marshall Plan to Europe. which is a tweak on its post-World War I plans. Post-World War I, they gave a bunch of loans in the Dawes Plan, but those had to be repaid. And that helped to contribute to the spread of the Great Depression. The Marshall Plan is just a big old box of money with a bow on top. You can have this money, you don't have to repay it, and the Marshall Plan is able to fund the rebuilding of Western Europe. In the East, the USSR, instead of helping the East to rebuild, they take as much as they can as far as technology, manufacturing ability, like manufacturing robots and things like that. They loot Eastern Europe and take that back to Russia to rebuild Russia at the cost of Eastern Europe. And so Eastern Europe doesn't rebuild as quickly as the West because the Soviet plan is very different than the US plan. And then as far as safety goes, you've got NATO in the West and you've got the Warsaw Pact in the East. NATO exists to protect against communism. The Warsaw Pact exists to protect against capitalism. And so they both exist to protect against the other one. And so that should answer 2, 3, 4, and 5. The 50s and 60s. So as far as Western Europe is concerned, these were pretty good years. The two goals of Western Europe are to protect against communism and prevent future wars. To get that done, both at the national level and the international level, Western Europe takes the approach that cooperation is the best way to make this happen. So at the national level, they establish a bunch of social welfare programs. These are designed to prevent extremism in the case of an economic downturn. Because the people who are in charge of Western Europe at this point are the same people who lived through World War II and the Great Depression that came before. And they understand the linkage that when the economy crashed, that allowed extremist forces to come to the front and lead these countries. And so the idea is, in the event of another Great Depression, we need to make sure that people don't hit rock bottom, okay? Because when people hit rock bottom, they make bad choices, like fascism. And so they post-war, a lot of these Western European countries create social welfare programs like public housing, if you need it, food assistance, if you need it, unemployment assistance, if you need it, old age pensions, if you need it. Like, it's all there if you need it. And it's designed to prevent extremism. On the international level, they create these supranational organizations like the European Coal and Steel Community and the Common Market. These are both designed to encourage cooperation among Western European countries. The political goal is, if we're cooperating, then we're not going to go to war. The political goal is peace and unity. The economic goal is prosperity. If we're working together, we can all get richer together. And so that should be 6 and 7, not in that order. And again, the Marshall Plan is providing the money and the funding to make these things happen. I'm going to go off script. I'm going to go rogue, and we're going to jump to 28. I'm going to do the women's movement, and then I'm going to do the youth movement, and then we'll go back to the East. And the reason is I'm going to link the women's movement and the youth movement to the economic success that Western Europe is having. Because there's so much demand for jobs, so much demand for workers, I should say. Women and teenagers enter the workforce in numbers we've never seen before. And as more and more women enter the workforce, we get new problems, new issues, I should say, that need to be addressed. Because what's happening is the women, like men, are going to work all day. But then when women come home, unlike men, there's still that separate spheres expectation that women will cook, clean, and take care of the kids, and that men will not. And so women have this double work day. They go to the workplace where they earn, then they go home where they work all evening without necessarily earning that wage. And so we get second wave feminism emerging as these new issues emerge for women. Some of the issues that second wave feminism is taking on are these. I don't think I showed you this when we did this last week or the week before. I would not write down all of them, but I might highlight the idea that second wave feminism is much more social and economic than first wave, which was the suffrage wave. And then maybe write down a couple of the ones that stand out to you. Issues that second wave feminism is addressing, things like discrimination, things like equal pay for equal work, paid maternity leave, or assisted childcare, the right to divorce, the right for assistance for single mothers, protection from rape and physical violence, right to an abortion. Some of these things to us might seem like shouldn't necessarily be much of a debate, like laws against discrimination or promoting equal pay for equal work. But again, or protection from physical violence or rape, like what's the debate? But these are issues that had to be brought up because they hadn't been addressed yet. And so this is second wave feminism. But as I mentioned before, things like assistance for single mothers, is every woman need assistance as a single mother? No. And so because not every woman needs that, not every woman is going to support that. And so it makes it more difficult for women to achieve the goals of second wave feminism. It's much more difficult than it was maybe the first time around in first wave with the suffrage movement. Okay, the other thing we see is the youth entering the workforce. And as youths enter the workforce, they get paid for that. And as they get paid for that, marketers begin to see, hey, young people have money. We should try to get their money. And so we see guys like Elvis Presley or the Beatles or Buddy Holly emerge, marketing to young people with that rock and roll that they do. Or you see, I don't know, marketers promoting things like poodle skirts or leather jackets or all those other styles I saw in that Grease movie with John Travolta. That's what the youth culture is into, right? That's what the kids do. And so we start to see this generation gap. Instead of having a monoculture that exists kind of for all people at all ages, we start to see a youth culture as well as an old people culture. This is going to culminate in 1968. As many baby boomers come of age at university where they've been exposed to many new ideas, they're going to protest in want of equality and the idea of building a better world. And so the youth protests, again, fueled by the prosperity of the 1950s and 60s. In the East, we also see prosperity, but you've also got other issues in the East. First of all, they've got to take care of this newly occupied territory. So places like East Germany and Hungary, they don't want to be communist, so they rise up. So what does the Soviet Union do for them? If you rise up in the Soviet Union, what do you get? Yeah. A tank! You get tanked. And so look, there's a tank in a city center. Again, it's like a thing, right? It's an Eastern European thing. And so they are putting down revolutions in these places that they've taken over. We're going to get into decolonization a little bit more here in a second, but as territories decolonize, the Soviet Union wants to be there to help support them in their newfound freedom, as long as they're communist, in places like Cuba and China, Korea, Vietnam. And then last but not least, they want to try to create an economy, a planned economy that has just the right balance of heavy industry and consumer goods. And of course, are they ever going to do that? They're never going to successfully create an economy that has enough consumer goods and enough heavy industry. They're always going to be on the side of heavy industry. But as we know, people want tchotchkes. People want little doodads, right? People want Funko Pops. Your grandma wants those little figurines that she's got on her mantelpiece, right? Right? And the communists would say, no, those are wasteful. But what do grandmas want? Tiny figurines. And they're never going to get them in the Soviet Union. And it's just a fact. All right, let's talk about decolonization. This is the lesson we were supposed to do before spring break, and then it flooded. And so a lot of this stuff is going to be newer stuff. So I wanted to make sure that I hit on this. After World War II, Western Europe tries to reclaim its colonies. It had lost many of them. The Japanese, for example, had quote, liberated a lot of territory in Asia. They said Asia for the Asians, but in many cases, like in the Philippines or in French Indochina or Singapore, it really just meant that the Japanese became the oppressors of these Asian peoples. And so after World War II, after the defeat of the Japanese, Western Europeans started to try to move back in because they wanted the resources of these colonies to help them rebuild back in Europe. But a lot of these colonies don't want to be colonies anymore. They want to be countries. Well, a lot of them didn't help in World War II like they helped in World War I, because after World War I, did they get the independence they thought they might get? No. And so why help? It's not going to help them. And so the USSR and the USA are in they're in different and unique positions. The Soviets have the benefit of not being friends with any of the Western European countries. For the US, what is their relationship to, say, the French during World War II? They're allies, and they were friends before war, and they're friends after war. And so you take a place like Vietnam. The French want to recolonize Vietnam. The Vietnamese don't want that. And so the Vietnamese are going to ask for help from somebody who's stronger than France. There are two countries that are stronger than France. Who are they? The US and the USSR. Now, the US, we already established, they're friends with the French. So can the Vietnamese come and ask the US for military assistance to get rid of the French? No, the US is not going to give guns to the Vietnamese, because then the Vietnamese are going to shoot the French, and the French and the US are friends. And so who are they going to ask if you're Vietnamese? The USSR. And the Soviets are going to say, yes, we don't like colonialism. We'll gladly help you. The US is in this awkward position that if they support the French, it looks like they're supporting colonialism, which is going to push a lot of French colonies into the hands of the USSR. And so behind the scenes, the US is encouraging decolonization, while in the front of the scenes, the USSR is providing military support to a lot of these colonies to get their freedom. Both of them are pushing for decolonization. The US just has a more precarious spot to be in. As far as where are we decolonizing? Everything that's shaded red is a place that gained its freedom between 1947 and 1975. We're talking about just an enormous chunk of the world. And this is also a decent map of the second imperialism. These are the places that got taken over. Notice that the Americas have largely, by this point, gotten their independence, except in just a few places. But this is a huge chunk of the world. And as these territories gain their independence, they are approached quickly to answer the question, whose side are you going to be on? You're going to be on the US side, or are you going to be on the Soviet Union side? Which side are you going to join? And for most of the countries, well, not for most, for some of the countries, they refuse to answer. These countries become known as the non-aligned. Take a country like India, for example. India gets its independence in 1947, and it's asked, are you going to support the US or the USSR? And India says, we're not going to support either. We're going to support India. We're not on the side of the US or the USSR. We're on India's side. And so they are considered non-aligned. They don't pick a side. 3 years ago, when Russia invaded Ukraine, the US and its Western European allies decided to boycott Russian oil. They weren't going to buy Russian oil, and they pressured their allies around the world to also not buy Russian oil. Well, when there's a ton of Russian oil and now there's nobody to buy it, what's going to happen to the price of Russian oil? It's going to be rock bottom, right? And so there was tons of pressure on India, which is a giant country with tons of people, don't buy Russian oil. And the Indian government said, why? why would we not buy Russian oil? Right? It's dirt cheap. What is best for India? To buy expensive oil or cheap oil? Cheap oil. And so India continued to buy Russian oil, not because they supported Russia or because they didn't like the US, but because they wanted to do what was best for them. And there was all kinds of press at the time. India's switching sides. The world's largest democracy is going to side with Russia. No, they didn't. They sided with India. And if people had gone back into the history and looked at the history of India, it would have been obvious what they were doing. There was no news story there. They were just not aligned. This one's not in the study guide, but I do like to mention neocolonialism. Neocolonialism is kind of like the Taylor Swift song that we were listening to, like, we're never getting back together, and then you called me up again last night. This is like that toxic period after you break up with somebody where like you still kind of hang out with them, and you probably really shouldn't, or like they like call you and you end up talking for like 30 minutes. Because you still kind of like them, but also there's that one thing. So that's what this is. Neocolonialism is that toxic breakup period where former colonies and former colonizers still hang out sometimes. And colonies, and the former colonies typically provide resources to their former colonizers, and former colonizers will typically give aid, financial or economic assistance to their former colonies. It's super toxic to a certain extent. But also, this is largely how things get done in the world today. This is one reason why when the Trump administration canceled US foreign aid or USAID, people were kind of like, why? Because the US, this is what the US does. We give gifts of financial aid and we help other countries because when we help them, they feel like they need to help us back in some way. And so when the US shuts down USAID, well, then we can't do nice things for other countries, which means that they're not going to do favors for us. And also it means that if we're not doing nice things for them, then some other country might step in and do nice things for them, like Russia or China. And then they develop a relationship with a different country. And so, again, this is kind of how things work right now as far as colonialism goes. It's all informal, but it's still very much there. And let's go back to the 70s. 1970s and 1980s, we got two impacts. This is number 23. Two impacts on this one. The oil shocks and the rise of the Asian tiger, Asian manufacturing economies. They both hit the East and the West hard. We see unemployment. We see people losing their houses because they can't make their mortgage payments. We see people not being able to buy food because they can't make ends meet because they lost their jobs and the oil is too expensive. But what we also see is that the post-war social welfare safety net that had been created right after World War II to prevent people from going crazy in the event of an economic downturn worked. People lost their jobs, but they had unemployment insurance. People might not be able to afford food, but government assistance programs stepped in. People may have lost their homes, but government housing was able to pick up the slack. And so the social welfare network worked to prevent people from turning to fascism or communism. In the West, we see flexibility. Capitalism is flexible and responsive, and it was able to adjust to the new situation. In the East, because it's a planned communist economy, it largely was unable to adjust. And so for number 27, what changes was the Soviet Union able to make? They weren't. They couldn't because communism, right? In the West, yes, the social welfare programs worked, but also they're becoming more expensive. And the neoliberals step in and have a suggestion. They say, we are going to cut taxes and we're going to cut some social welfare programs. Like when Margaret Thatcher takes the milk out of schools, Maggie Thatcher, milk snatcher, she's cutting some welfare programs. Not all of them, but some of them. They're cutting government-owned businesses. They're cutting government regulation. The idea was to increase private profits and that those would then help to pay for the government programs. Now, as far as results go, it kind of worked and it also kind of didn't. People really like not paying as many taxes, but as far as the social programs that weren't able to be cut, a lot of them remain. And so as a result, we're paying for a lot of things that, well, I shouldn't say, we're not actually collecting enough taxes to pay for the benefits we get, which is why starting in the 1980s, government debts begin to rise in huge numbers. Today, we have a $1 trillion+ debt, and most of that, or not most of that, but that trend began under Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. We borrow the money to pay for the social services that we're not paying taxes for. So the neoliberals did all of that stuff. Let's see. Out in the East, in the 70s, we see the wealth gap shrink. The rich are not as rich in the Soviet Union, and the poor are not so poor in the Soviet Union. Everybody's just kind of in the middle. But the lack of choice, the lack of freedom, the lack of incentive and economic opportunity largely caused dissatisfaction. People are just going through the motions. And so to try to inject some energy into communism, we get Mikhail Gorbachev and his proposed ideas to improve the economy. We call that one perestroika. We're on 31 now. Perestroika is the attempt to improve the economy, the attempt to improve personal freedoms and liberties. That's glasnost. Perestroika is a failure. Glasnost, big success. People love talking smack about the Soviet Union. They've been saving it up for a while. And then democratization is also a huge success. Because when people finally get a choice in their government, they, in huge numbers, choose not communism. So then, what is it, 30? I'll get back to solidarity in a second. 32, perestroika, economic reform. Was it successful? No. What was glasnost? Increased transparency and freedom in the Soviet Union. And then democratization is 34. Essentially, when people get to choose, they choose to not be Soviet Union anymore. In Poland, we get the rise of Solidarity. Solidarity is significant because it is a labor union that represents the workers better than their communist country does. And then it becomes essentially the first free government of Poland afterward. So describe the revolutions. Poland democratically chooses not to be communist. East Germany, the Berlin Wall falls in November 1989. Czechoslovakia, very peaceful. They call it the Velvet Revolution because it's just so smooth. Essentially, the communist government was like, you guys don't want us anymore? All right, deuces. And they just walked. Real easy. Romania, people died. Violent. And in Russia, it's similar to Poland. Democratically choose not to be communist. And of course, there's some drama, but not as much as, say, Romania. All right, so then what happens after communism? The 1990s are a period of readjustment. In the East, in the beginning, it's a complete mess. Huge economic downturn in Eastern Europe in the early 1990s. The West is much wealthier. But now that borders are open, we see actually a lot of immigration. People move from the East to the West, which is why you've got a pretty sizable Polish population in Britain today, because people in Eastern Europe are trying to find jobs. The West is trying to continue its project of cooperation within Europe. It worked in the West to defeat communism. So now that these countries are free, let's integrate them into the new situation. And so we get things like the East joining NATO and the EU, which is formed in 1993. And in 1998, the euro is adopted. So the common market becomes the EU, more or less. But all this cooperation has its own problems. You know, as the EU becomes stronger, the EU begins to make decisions for all of Europe. So then who do you prefer to listen to? Do you prefer to listen to your local or national government where the people think and talk like you? Or do you listen to the unified government of the EU, where the people don't necessarily think and talk like you? As we get massive migrations from Eastern Europe to Western Europe, and we get massive in-migration from post-colonial areas like the huge Southern Asian population that exists in Britain, or the North African Muslim population that exists in France, or the large Turkish population that exists in Germany, what does it mean to be British or French or German? Are these people who've come in, these immigrants from Eastern Europe and outside of Europe, are they also French and British? What does it mean to be French or British? Is that even the question that they should be asking? A lot of these countries are having identity crises as Europe changes, because they're not sure what the answers to any of these questions are. And these aren't questions that I expect us to answer. These are questions that Europe is asking itself right now. What does it mean to be French? And is that a question that we should even ask? All right. That's all I got.